So we broadened quite a bit, didn't we, in the last video by shifting from the generative paradigm to looking at some features of human versus animal communication and interspecies communication. Let's get a bit broader still. An awful lot of approaches to language, treated quite sensibly, as if we were passing messages among each other. So I think of something, it's kind of secret, you don't know it. I encode it in words, pass it to you, you decode it. That very way of thinking about language requires one to assume that I have a secret mind and you have a secret mind. And remember, in cognitive science, that's always kind of up for grabs. Your assumptions about minds are never safe, and there's always another way to look at things. So while this is a very sensible way to view language, it is by no means the only way, and if we adopt this view, we miss some things. So we're going to switch now and drop that assumption. In all the treatment of language we've seen so far, the whole of structuralism and generative linguistics, there's been an emphasis on abstraction, on symbolic structure, and on rules. And throughout the 20th century, increasingly, of course, as the computational metaphor became so entrenched, everything is seen as some kind of code. People who work with language have become also worried a little bit about this, because when you observe language in the wild, and remember science begins with observation, not with abstraction. When you observe language, you find lots of aspects of language which are not well covered by such an approach. So look what I'm doing with my hand. My hand is part of my speaking right now. And there's nothing in linguistics that would tell you that. My eyes are really important, even though I'm speaking to a camera. I sort of feel like I'm speaking to you a little bit. If we were speaking face to face, we would be paying attention and turning our gaze to common objects. The context in which we speak really matters and influences what we say. You're not going to speak in a church like you speak in the playground. So there's lots of things that affect our languaging, let's say, that are not well described using codes and messages. So that's why languaging is a much broader term than language. And increasingly, many of us linguists are starting to think about languaging as a much broader, ill-defined set of activities that we need to consider if we want to understand language in a big picture. So when we were in the generative paradigm, there was an assumption that there was a system, and that system would have a name like English or French or Irish. If we look back through history, it's not possible for such a system to even exist until you have complex human societies with lots of practices like schools, authorities, preferences for one form of communication over another. And all this comes about, only in the last few thousand years, 6,000 years. And then writing comes about 5,000 years ago. On the large scale of evolutionary time, that's a very, very short period indeed. So that thinking about language as systematic blinds us to the long history of our species. And if we want to understand what it was that profoundly changed the human species, we'll need to adopt a different perspective than this systematic kind of perspective. And we need to consider lots of possibly relevant behaviors that allow us to coordinate, communicate, join forces, work together, or even against each other, using the voice and the whole body. This is what languaging attempts to get at. Here's a timescale. The green line shows just the last 50,000 years. I said writing was invented about 5,000 years ago. Human cultural development in the sense of organization and with rituals, with artifacts, it's probably about 50,000 years old. Other people might put that at maybe twice that, or maybe longer. What's quite clear is that writing only occupies a tiny bit of that. That's the red bar. And writing was always an elite kind of carry on, a skill that was possessed by very few people until the introduction of the printing press. That's only 500 years ago. So widespread literacy is extremely recent. So to build an approach to understanding language that doesn't care whether the language is on the page or in the flesh, as it were, whether it's spoken or written, is to be bound to a view of language which requires widespread literacy. To be bound to a view of language in which language is seen as systematic is to be bound to the last 5,000 or 6,000 years of human history. But the thing that affected our species, that separates us from the apes, has been coming along for 5 or 6 million years. So there's lots of other angles to explore here. My own work is going to be used to wrap up this section on language, and I study a kind of language, I will say, or languaging, which is not captured by the generative approach. It's about something called joint speech, or you might think of it as chanting. Now, chanting or joint speech happens whenever a bunch of people say the same thing at the same time, or sing the same thing at the same time. That's a fairly simple definition, isn't it? We could go out there and we could be clear when we're observing joint speech or when we're not observing joint speech. And the thing about joint speech is you wouldn't find it everywhere, but where you do find it, there's something interesting going on. You'll find it in temples, and you'll find it in football stadia, and you'll find it in courtrooms, and you'll find it in classrooms. So the context in which this kind of speaking happens is really, really important. So that's the definition, found whenever multiple people say the same words at the same time. Using that as a way of beginning the inquiry draws us immediately to considering rituals. Rituals are a very, very old part of human sociality. Practices of prayer, hardly scientifically studied at all. The role of oaths, swearing, public swearing of oaths and pledges of allegiance. Protests. There's so much protest going on, and the collective voice in joint speech is there all the time. It's a very important part of human sociality. We find it in sports, in the sports domain, not in every sports tradition, but in those sports particularly in which there's cross-generational support for a team. So English soccer has this, of course. People tend to support the team that their father supported. That's a lot like having the same religion that your parents had, or voting for the same politician that your parents voted for. Chanting seems to invoke meditation, harmony, nice things. It's also the way that school children bully each other. A group of children will gang up and chant at the child who's being bullied. And we see this in Donald Trump's campaign chants as well. USA, lock him up, is also a form of bullying. But all of these activities, whether they're good or bad, are foundational for human social organization. And you might think that you're excused from this because you're a modern secular person, never go to church, never take part in anything, but you probably still sing happy birthday, don't you? That's joint speech. That's a ritual. So let's just have a look at some joint speech and see how this definition brings us to see things as connected that we wouldn't otherwise see as connected. So we'll start with some nuns from County Cork.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Group of nuns saying the rosary. What on earth could a scientist see there? Well, let's have a look at some of the structures here. There was one person started and then everyone joined in. So there's a differentiation here into call and response, as it were. The activity of praying the rosary is repeated very, very regularly, and it involves an awful lot of repetition. Indeed, beads to structure that repetition are found in lots and lots of religious faiths, not just among the Catholics. Um, Further study of the structure here reveals an intricate patterning in which the role of leader and follower is alternated. We won't need to get into that, but we're just going to compare the nuns in County Cork with these protesters in Cairo. The activity of protesting might seem very different from that of praying, but look what we just spotted. Here we also have a call and response in which the leader gives a word and then the group joins in collectively, making it clear that there's something going on here that bears some kind of comparison to the nuns. And this happens all the time when you turn your attention to joint speech. And it's perplexing because the usual way that we think about language tells us nothing here. So usually when you think about language, you think of a separation between speakers and listeners, or readers and writers. And in joint speech, everyone knows the words, and speakers and listeners are not separate. And things are repeated, and the repetition is important. We find the repetition in the rosary, but we find the repetition in the protest as well. And we find the repetition on the football stadiums, and we find the repetition in the primary school classrooms. So the repetition tells us it's not important, perhaps, precisely what the words mean. What's important is that they have to be performed. They have to be carried out. And in so doing, a group identity comes into being, whether it's of a nuns in a convent or protesters supporting a cause. If you find yourself in Cairo and that demonstration is going on, if you join in the chant, you're one of that group. If you choose not to join in the chant, you can legitimately say you're not. A lot of theoretical weight has been placed on the creativity of language. We've noted how creative language is. Joint speech is not that creative. The texts are already existing. They're not made up on the spot. And there are structural properties that are quite different from the structural properties of conversation. This call and response is entirely generic. We find it in football chants, we find it in classroom chants, we find it in all over the place. Another thing that's really interesting is that in a ritual ceremony, there's generally some way of taking a nuanced, important text and integrating it into the ritual without running the risk of having people mess up the text. So a liturgy is a kind of text that's protected over sometimes hundreds, even 1,000 years. And because we have this call and response role, we can have one expert say the important bits that you can't get wrong. And everyone else can join in by saying, well, amen, or right on, or yeah. So there's a form of generalized assent that allows everyone to participate in the message, even when some careful bits have to be carefully spoken by an expert. And one last thing that's quite perplexing is that the distinction that we normally assume exists between music on the one hand and language on the other goes away. So the word chant is completely ambiguous with respect to whether something is spoken or whether it's sung, and we find all kinds of hybrids here. So there's no speech-music divide. We get a rhythmicity to the spoken word. The repetition brings about a sort of a melodic contour, and we can no longer tell speech and music apart. Here's a little example of one musical-like form which we know the origin of, but which keeps cropping up now. This comes from 1970s, from Chile, from the election campaign of Salvador Allende, who had this chant, which in Spanish is a Spanish one, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. My Spanish is terrible, sorry. Which in English means the people united will never be defeated. And he was deposed in a CIA-led coup in 1973, and this chant then, which had been part of his election campaign, became a template for protest chants around the world. So it goes, the people united will never be defeated. Here it is in New York. That's the Spanish original. But here's a group of students in Dublin protesting about their university fees. No ifs, no buts, no education cuts. Here's a chant from Cairo from the tragically named Arab Spring. Bit of musical support there. Ashab Yurid Iskat Nizam. This was the signature chant of the protest movement that originated in 2010-2011 around the Eastern Mediterranean. The people demand the fall of the regime is the way it's always translated, but you can see that there's a musical form here, which was known to the students in Dublin, which was known to the people in New York, which comes from the 1970s in Chile, and we can find it as far away as the south of Sudan here. Of course, there's a lot more going on here, but it shows you that when you adopt a different perspective, you see very, very different things. So joint speech doesn't exist in the science of linguistics, but in the broader inquiry into languaging, it most certainly plays a very important role. There's a lot more information on it there, and I'll put a video on Brightspace. Some of the puzzles that come up here, we noted, are because we've left the idea of the exchange of messages from one person to another. That's not what's going on here. So is there a technical vocabulary that might help us out? There is, and we won't get to it in any detail in this module. Enaction is an emerging philosophically and biologically motivated framework in which we don't use the vocabulary of psychology, which always has one mind, one person, but we look at activity that brings something about. And in this case, the activity is always of a group of people that bring about a group identity. So this is one way of moving into the collective sphere a little bit. Okay, that brings us to the end of the unit on language, an extremely rich topic, and we could have gone in so many directions. In the next unit, we're going to turn to human learning and development.